G'day folks, welcome to how to build a wood-fired oven. If this is looking too daunting for you with all that sandstone, don't worry yourself about that. You can build it out of cement blocks, or you can build it out of brick and have it bag washed or rendered. Or you can even build it on an existing concrete slab that you have somewhere lying around in the garden at the right level, of course. I live in a lovely old stone cottage in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales, which is about an hour and a half's drive southwest of Sydney. Fortunately, we have a lot of these sandstone blocks lying around, so I was able to use all the sandstone from around the house. As you can see, folks, from the images there, where I decided to build the oven was quite a bit lower than the existing concrete slab, so we've had to basically build it up a little bit with some sandstone blocks, bit of mortar mix. The mortar mix is basically 5 parts yellow bricky sand to 1 part off-white cement. So make a note of that, 5 parts yellow bricky sand to 1 part off-white cement. That'll match up with the sandstone beautifully. Just to level it off, I've just used some river rocks that I had lying around from another project, and just to level it off before we start working on the first layer slab. So as you can see, leveling everything off is very important. We want a nice level slab so we don't have any problems down the track. So there's the formwork, there's the waterproof membrane, and these are 3 dowel joints, so they're basically 8mm steel rods that I've drilled into the existing slab because there's a lot of weight going on this slab and I don't want it to sink into the ground, so we put some steel dowel joints, they're called, drilled into the existing slab. There's a water pipe for my garden that runs in behind all of that, so I just had to allow for that as well. Throwing in some steel reinforcement there with those little plastic lifters, can't remember what they're called, but and then tying it all together with little bits of wire, and onto the cement mixing for the slab. It's all pretty straightforward, folks. It's good to have a helper here mixing, leveling off the slab bit by bit with a piece of timber, and then smoothing it off with a trowel, making sure there's no air bubbles, so giving it a bit of a poke and a prod. Now, because part of the slab is going to be exposed because there's a stone archway there, I decided to put a little edge on it, so I've used this edger that you can buy at the local hardware store. Just put a little edge around it. I actually went around the whole slab, but only needed to do the front. But it looks very neat, and here we are starting on the stonework, layer by layer. Fortunately, I had these blocks already cut for me by some fellow probably 100 odd years ago. The 3 tools that I used the most were these 3: the Bricky's hammer, which I bought recently, the mallet, and the cold chisel. Making sure the structure is level as you progress through the job is all important. So we're just building layer upon layer. The square edges there you see on that sandstone I did before we laid the stone. I cut those with the chisel by hand, and I'll get onto that at another time. This is just doing the jointing so that square edge appears to continue down the front of the stone, and it looks very yellow now, but when that dries it'll be very much the sandstone colour, which is what we want with that mix. When laying all these stones, make sure you have a bucket and a sponge to wet down the stones before they have the mortar mix thrown under them. With all this edging here, I've left that mortar mix probably 15, 20 minutes, 25 minutes perhaps, just to harden up a little bit before I attack it, like we're looking at in that little video clip. And next job on the list is just to give it a quick brush down, just to smooth out the edges, and don't be afraid to go a little bit harder than what I'm doing there on the video. Adding layers to the walls, we come to this lovely drawing of the stone arch. And to get the stone arch looking the way I wanted it to look, literally I just looked on Google for stone arch images and then worked out how wide the blocks were that I had, how high I needed it to be, how much of a gap I needed between the keystone in the middle and the bottom to keep the wood store nice and generously proportioned. And from some plywood that I had lying around the house, I created the timber arch to support the stonework as it gets laid in place to start with, just to make sure it all fits, and then cement it together when we're happy with the way it all sits there. You can see I've put little wedges there to keep them separated a little bit at the bottom and the top, just to give it the sense of the mortar mix filling in the gaps. And you'll notice that the first block that I laid I had to redo. You'll have to go back and look at that, but the two big blocks on the left and right, I had to recut those because I wasn't happy with the shape of the initial ones. They were too small. It wasn't giving me enough space for that keystone. So look, we're laying them all in place, and we've allowed for that keystone, and then I've measured the gap there and then put it out on the stone that I'm about to cut with the big angle grinder. And the angle grinder cuts obviously from all four sides, and then we put the chisels in place once we've cut all four sides, and we just gently tap it and it will gently come away. And there you have the keystone, ladies and gentlemen, sitting there lovely in place, ready for the mortar mix. Before I did the mortar mix, I put a nail in the middle of that arch and chisel on the end of the string, and then I marked out where I wanted these square edges to be, and I just chiseled them bit by bit by bit by bit by bit by bit by bit, and finally got there. It was a bit of a tedious exercise, but gee, it looks lovely. The only one that I didn't do with that is the keystone at the top, as you can see, once it's all mortared in. I then left it a day or so before I started the next step, which was, as you can see, measuring up for the next stones that were in that pencil drawing, coming up to the top, making sure that we're all level so we know exactly the dimension of the stones that we need to cut, and cut in a similar fashion the keystone was cut, bit by bit by bit. You get your angles right by trial and error, basically, and making sure you're using that spirit level the whole time, is to get a nice even surface for the pizza oven at the end of the day. This next image shows the pointing after the mortar has been laid. Looks a little bit more organic, ladies and gents, a little bit more organic, not as refined as the first one that we showed you in that brief video, but I like the look of it. Laying the slab for the surface, this was interesting, trial and error exercise. I realised that I'd actually made this base a little bit too small for the pizza oven that I needed, because we really need about close to 1 metre internal diameter of the pizza oven. So I had to extend this slab out the back, which you can see that slight overhang, which we supported with timber. So we've got some timber supports inside the wood store part of the sandstone, supporting the base of the slab, and that base of the slab I left there. We didn't actually take it out because I've cut it slightly larger than the opening and supported it with some timber supports underneath. So as you can see, the plywood there covering the hole in the wood store, just covering the edges of the stone, just so that piece of plywood is still there to this day underneath the concrete slab. Only I just thought that was the easiest way to do it. And then we've got the timber frame for the slab, a little bit of reinforcement. This slab I did about 75 to 80 mil thick, so I didn't go overboard. You can see I'm going to take the tape of the corners there, so I had to cut some bar and wire it up there, and it was a bit hot, so we had to put the umbrella up. So there are my corners there to taper the slab so it doesn't look too obtrusive sticking out the back. This next image is the 40mm thick vermiculite layer that comes in strips of 600. You can buy this elsewhere, but I managed to find this at a local shop that sells heating equipment. But you can buy this from the specialist store, which is coming up in a minute. So this 40mm thick layer, I've just drawn out the thickness of the pizza oven, which I've actually adjusted even further from this drawing, because I was thinking that I was going to be making it out of brick, until I met the people that are coming up in next frame, Field Furnace Refractories in Western Sydney, who basically advised me, well, not advised me, but suggested, do I really want to make this out of brick? And I thought, well, if there's another alternative, I'm all ears. And there is an alternative, which is making the dome, rather than from bricks, from a refractory cement mix that they supply, which we'll come to a little later. So the only bricks that I actually purchased from the refractory company were the bricks for the first layer of the oven, the perimeter layer of the oven, and the two arches, which is one is the entry to the oven, and the larger arch is of course for the flue, the chimney.
Now at the Field Furnace Refractories, they had some timber arches that you could hire to support the arch that you had to build for the flue or the chimney. The other alternative was he could lay out some packing paper and put the arch down on the packing paper and spray around it, and then draw onto it. You'll see if you start on the bottom left, there's 63, then there's 51, and so on and so on. Well, that's the dimension of the brick. 63 is the larger brick, 51 is the smaller brick, and he basically shows you where to put the bricks in the course of the arch. So getting it home, I basically just had to cut it out and draw around it and build my own arch. So two of these I needed, obviously, for the archway, and there we have it. The pizza oven base tiles laid and the first layer of bricks going in. So that first layer of bricks around the perimeter of the oven were the only bricks that were laid. The next image is basically cutting out the archway for the flue archway, for the two frames for the flue archway. And you can see in this image you've got the concrete slab, and then on the left you've got the two bricks, the refractory bricks. You can see the vermiculite layer on top of the concrete slab, and then the base tile for the oven, and then another gap before the timber frame. So above the two bricks on the left, that's where the tapered bricks start on either side. And if you follow those instructions that you get from the refractory company that supplied all the brick and the tile for the base tiles for the oven, then you'll get a flue arch looking a little bit like this. And then we start the chimney. They supplied me with the bricks for the chimney as well, which were all specified and quite simple to follow. And really, if you wanted to just make your archways and flues out of regular bricks or regular refractory bricks, you can do that as well. You just have larger mortar joints in between where the arch curves across, of course. And I might just add here that all the jointing cement for these refractory bricks needs also to be a refractory mix. It can't just be regular cement, otherwise it just won't stand the hot temperatures. Just as a side note, folks, with all my cutting of these bricks, I basically used an old drop saw that I bought, I think in 1989 or 1990, it's that old, and I replaced the blade with a stone blade, and it did the job. I just trickled a little bit of water with the cut from a hose, and it did the job quite nicely. The next thing I did back the front was build the door to the pizza oven before the archway. So I probably should have built the archway first anyway. My son, who worked at the local pub, met a fella called Doug, who was a sheet metal worker, one of the regulars at the pub, and he said, I could make your dad a pizza oven door, no problem. So I met him at the pub and gave him the dimensions, the width, the height at where the arch was supposed to start turning, and we basically had to build the arch to suit the pizza oven door. Thank you, Doug, for an amazing job, and thanks to my amazing next door neighbour Graham, who turned those lovely timber handles from a piece of burr that I'd had for years and years, that my brother left with me when he went overseas. Thanks, Pete, for the burr, and thanks, Graham, for the lovely turned handles. So here we are doing things back to front, getting the timber arches made for the rear arch, the pizza oven door arch. from the door that Dougie had already made for us. So the pizza door arch to the oven, we basically used the smaller profile bricks from the refractory company. So they were the 51mm bricks. So there you can see two regular shaped bricks, which I've cut in half because we didn't need the full depth of the brick. Cut in half, so we've got those two bricks, and then we start from those two bricks on the left and right. We start the curved arch with the 51mm profile pre-cut arch bricks. We left that to dry for another day just to give it a bit of strength, and then we added the chimney. Those chimney bricks were all supplied by the field furnace refractory company as per their specs, and there it is in all its glory, ladies and gentlemen. And as I was desperate for a beer at the end of the day, my lovely neighbour Graham had some leftover VBs that he'd had stashed away from I think 4 years ago, but they tasted bloody marvellous, and I had more than one. Next job, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, is to build the sand dome for the pizza oven. So this was basically done with 3 polystyrene crates from my friends at Highlands Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Market in my local town of Mittagong. So you can see there's 3 polystyrene crates, then all the off-cut bricks packed in around it, and then basically just a slightly damp bricky sand, so I could reuse it because I needed lots of bricky sand. So just a yellow bricky sand, slightly moist, made into the shape of the oven. And then once we've made the shape of the oven with the slightly damp bricky sand, we then cover the whole dome in newspaper, and then we cover the newspaper with Glad wrap. As you can see, Glad wrap going over the damp newspaper. The next job is to mix up the refractory dome mix, which has a surprisingly small amount of water in it. You can't put too much water in it. The mix is quite specific, which will vary from mix to mix, product to product. There's my little helper, Wilbur, mixing up the refractory mix, basically making hamburger patty size, slightly oversized hamburger patty sized balls, and then gently squashing them into the dome shape, making sure that they join nicely. And the next job is putting on the layer of insulation wool, which is a very thick, stiff kind of wool, so it actually forms over the dome shape quite nicely. You have to cut it at little triangles here and there to make it fit the spherical shape. Then once you've laid 2 layers of this, which is about, I think it's about 25mm thick, so you end up with about a 50mm layer, and of course making sure that the joins of this insulation layer aren't on top of each other, so cut them accordingly. Then once we've laid the insulation layer over the dome, then we basically cover it with a very fine chicken wire, not the 1mm chicken wire, the thinner chicken wire, so it's easy to lay on and tie it up. And we're getting to the pointy end of this whole exercise, ladies and gentlemen, where we cover the chicken wire and the insul wool, or the insulation wool, with our render mix. Now the render mix is basically exactly the same mix that we were using, so the same colour as the jointing for the sandstone. So do you remember that? It was 5 parts yellow bricky sand to 1 part off-white cement. And we do this in several layers, 2 to 3 layers, giving it a day in between to dry. So 2 to 3 layers, thin layers of the bricky sand and off-white cement mix. Then once we've left the oven to cure for a day or 2, you can start with some very small curing fires. Not really huge heat, just little fires at a time, and probably 1 a day for the next couple of days, and then you can start cooking whatever you want in your brand new wood-fired oven. And this was my very first pizza, which I was incredibly impressed with, but it's very difficult to impress a 14-year-old boy. Look at me, I'm happy.